My mom got diagnosed with cancer. I remember hearing about it, and the doctors were like, hey, you got a year. And immediately you're like, I got to pray, because now God's real. I need him to be real. I have to have him be real, because he's got to save my mom, because he can do it. My mom was a lively person. She's the reason for half of my hobbies and passions. And watching her just suffer through something like this was really shaking me to my core, because it was these pastors I'd worked with for years who had embezzled money, who had abused people, who'd slept around, who'd molested. How are they still doing these things in your name, and you're not doing anything? And my mom, who was faithfully in the front row of church every day, who gave and is pleading with you to save her, and you're doing nothing. And it just kept every day wrecking me.
The Courageous Conversations Conference is so important, because where else can we have these types of conversations with these types of thought leaders about these types of topics?
It is a unique and a rare opportunity to come and hear voices that have been trained in diverse places, coming together to ask these kind of critical questions in humility, in love, in conviction, and in courage.
If you're on the fence in a broader sense about any questions you have to do with the faith, this is the right place.
This is modeling for us, how do we live in a world in which there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different points of view, even in the church, and how do I navigate that and not have to compromise what I believe?
But that is exactly why all of us need to be attending the Courageous Conversations Conference, because in a world full of crucifixion, somebody needs to start having the conversation.
Where else can you come and get both perspectives from predominantly Black and brown leaders, thinkers, scholars, preachers, pastors? There's nowhere else you can go. You need to be here at the Courageous Conversations Jude 3.
Welcome to another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder and president of the Jude 3 Project. And we're continuing our series on my book, When Faith Disappoints. As you can see here, the gap between what we believe and what we experience. And I'm just sitting down with various people talking about their disappointments with God. And the themes around the book that I think will be helpful. And today I'm joined by someone who, if you've been to Courageous Conversations, you've probably seen him running around. He often helps with our video production. And so he is not behind the camera today. He is in front of the camera. So welcome, Scott.
Happy to be here. It is a little weird being on this side of the camera. It doesn't happen very often, but I'm happy to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
Yeah. I've known Scott. I knew you before I knew Lance.
Yeah, you did. I think it was way back. I mean, it was a long time ago, because we had mutual connections within.
Yeah.
So I was in ministry and worked within ministry and worked with a lot of different Christian artists for well over a decade. And I think just in Jacksonville, our lives cross and intertwine that way.
Yeah.
It is a small town, but it's a big town.
Yeah. So tell our audience just a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, so I, like I said, I've been in ministry, or was in ministry for about 10 years, serving as everything from, an intern, kind of working my way up, became a youth director, and then I was a youth pastor, and then was a creative director, then I became just a videographer and working in a bigger church, and kind of spent a lot of time doing that. And then I currently run my own production. I do a lot of freelance work and do video work, like for Jude 3 and for other projects and things like that. And that's kind of just the basics of me. I'm married, got 2 little boys, just have been around and done a lot in my 30 years or so. And that's kind of just me. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your journey to faith.
Yeah, so I would define it as like I was, and this is what I always say, we were front row Baptists. So you had back row Baptists, those are the ones that sneak in and out. You had middle row Baptists, they just come. Front row Baptists, if the door is open, we were there. My parents were both very involved in the church, especially my dad with a lot of men's ministry and different organizations. He was a part of like the Promise Keepers movement and all of those things in the 90s. So me and my sister, we were at church as soon as it was open, and that was just kind of how it was. So, we didn't know much of a time that it wasn't. And even going that much when you're young, like you can build your own resentment, but we always worked through it. And that was our life. It was go to church every chance you got, and we were there. And I'd like to say, like, I came to the understanding of God a little bit early on. I would say, like, I said the prayer and all that, relatively young. But I really don't think God opened my eyes and I really was saved until much later. Because my faith in that early time was very much, do you want to go to heaven with mom and dad, or do you want to go to hell? Like, those are your options. And it's like, whoa, okay, I don't want to go to hell. I want to go to heaven. That I'll say this and kind of go with it. And I think all of it, understanding now, was like, it was God wooing and working his way kind of to build that relationship and pull me closer to him. But at that time I was young, and that's kind of just how it started. And that was my faith for a while. We'd moved around for churches, and it was in the shuffle. And I think this is a story a lot of people have, which is, when you go to church for a long time, the faith isn't yours, it's your parents. And that was really what it was. And then when I hit high school, it was my first real exposure because I was given more freedom. You're kind of just really discovering who you are. So in high school, I didn't connect well with my youth group. I had gone through like 3 youth pastors. I just didn't have a lot of friends in the group. So it was easy for me to just kind of fade out and be like, I don't want to go. And you're older. My parents gave me that ability to be like, all right, well, if you're not going to go, you need to stay at the home, which I almost never did. But I had the taste of freedom and, did what typical high school boys would do, chase girls and popularity and everything else under the sun. And that was kind of my faith for a while. And then about the time we all went to college, everybody was getting ready to go to college, I had a plan set in place. I was going to go play lacrosse and go be a part of Florida Southern down in South Florida, and I was very excited. But like, the more we went and the trips I was going to, the more I didn't feel like, I was like, this doesn't feel like a great idea. This feels like a bad decision. And my dad was very frank. He's like, look, this is a lot of money. Do you want to do this or not? And I was like, I don't think so. And he's like, well, that's a no then. Because if you don't know for a fact, don't do it. So I backed out of it. And that became this weird resentment of like, God, why does this happen? Because I always at that point, I wasn't attending church really. I wasn't really close to God. But he was definitely the blame for all my problems. Because that's just kind of how it goes. It's like, you in those moments, you don't think about God unless you're sick or you need something, or when something goes wrong. And that's kind of how it was. But outside of that, I stayed back here, went to a community college in Jacksonville, and I actually got connected with a friend of mine from high school who was like diehard, carried the Bible everywhere, and I was like, this dude is just the worst. But he was such a good guy, and he was like, hey, I'd started setting up a studio to record music, and he brought over some Christian artists, and these dudes just really got around me, and they introduced me to something I had never really experienced, which was theology. I'm a very logical person, very analytical, and if things weren't making sense, especially for the God I knew coming out of a traditional Southern Baptist church, like, do this, don't do this, God is always good, all this stuff, it was hard to reconcile a lot of things. But the theology helped. It was like, okay, now I understand God better. I'm understanding the theology of grace. I'm understanding these points. And I really came up in that young, restless reform movement that was going on. And I was, it caught fire in me because it appealed to that logical side of me. It appealed to all the things. And it was like, yeah, we're going to go kick in doors, tell people their theology's bad. We got this. Like, I was the definition of young. I was restless and I was reformed. I was ready to go. And that's what sparked my ministry movement. So I got in as a church resident and then started doing video work. Then I got a job as a youth leader, then a youth pastor, and then kind of just grew from there. And then it all kind of fell off, through various things that I'm sure we'll get into. But that's kind of the basis of how I came to Jesus. But in that, these guys were praying with me, and I really did feel like at that moment, that was where I was like, I got it. It really felt like God had opened my eyes to understanding who he is really, at least what I thought at the time.
Mm-hmm. No, that's helpful. And it's funny because we were talking about the people that kind of helped you with understanding theology and having a framework for your faith. Most of those people are not in the faith anymore.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're not anywhere near like they were. Those were the guys that were I could go to and kind of always talk about scripture with, but it was kind of all of them for various reasons fell off for whatever. Life has a way of hitting us.
What do you think the gap was for you and many of your friends where it's like, we're on fire for God, we want to help people understand God and theology? What was that part where it's like, this isn't what we thought it was?
I think 3 things for me. One of the big ones for all of us, though, is life. I keep going back to KB, the artist, has a part of one of his songs where he talks about how he's on fire for God, and then he's like, I just want to retire with savings. And it's that parallel between when you start on fire, it's hard to maintain that fire if it's just you maintaining it, because life just keeps slinging and it keeps hitting. And eventually you're just like, look, man, I get it. I wanted to do all those things. I wanted to go be a missionary. I wanted to do all those things. But now I'm just like, I just want to retire, leave something for the kids. Like, I want to not be exhausted all the time. And that's literally what I think got a lot of them is just life hit. But I know for me personally, it went beyond that. It was, there was a lot of things that started to occur later on, especially working in ministry. You start to see church hurt, and it starts to become very real. And for a lot of it, I was like, look, I'm very self-aware when I'm to blame for stuff. And I'm like, all right, when I was an intern, I was dumb. I was young. I thought I was going to be super cool. And church ministry wasn't going to be sweeping up stuff. Like, I didn't understand it then. But as I got older, things got more complicated. And like, we really experienced, especially my family, especially my wife, like some serious hurt at the hands of some pastors. And I was just like, man, you expect to get hit and stabbed by the world, but to get beaten down by the church, and to just be like, oh, well, it kind of becomes one of those things where you're like, God, come on, man. Like, why? And I know the excuse, and this is where it kind of started, was the excuse is always, well, those are God's, that's just people, and, it's not God, don't let them. And it was like, it always hit my analytical side, because I'm like, well, this is a really personal faith. It's a community-driven faith. It's like hard to really disconnect that. Like, it doesn't answer the question. So that's what started that kind of division there. And then just kind of, somewhere in all of that, I think you lose the understanding that like God is someone you can talk to and wrestle with. And it ends up being where we're so focused on wrestling against him rather than like really coming to him with these like, hey, help my unbelief, man. I'm in a point where like I'm not on fire. I don't know what it is. And I'm trying, but it's only making it worse. And that's kind of those avenues that I think hit all of us, but I know me in particular.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember some of the friends you had. It's funny because I think it was a guy that was adjacent to the group, but he was still kind of in the group. Yeah. He unfollowed me on social media one time because he felt like I was listening to somebody that was a heretic.
Yeah.
And it's funny because now he's an atheist. And I was like, he was like sending me like John Piper clips. I was like, I'm in seminary, right?
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, but I just feel like you're not sound enough. And so you kind of went through that phase too. What do you think, not maybe as extreme as him, but what do you think kind of put you in that space? Was it some emotionally unhealth in your own heart, or you just wanted people to hear truth? How were you processing during that time?
I think the whole movement, if I look back on it, like that whole era of time was really driven by this core of like, there was a lot of like, we want people to understand the truth because we came from this workspace faith that just burns you out, that never worked. It was like a good start. But what ends up coming out of that is hubris and ego. And it became this, well, now I need to not just tell you about how my faith is, or how the faith actually should be. I need to make sure you understand that you're dumb and you need to listen to these people. And it happened so fast. Like, because I remember kind of being the person who's like, I need to send you this Piper clip. Have you heard of Matt Chandler? And like, even back in the day, it was like, hey, did you see this Driscoll thing? He yelled at these dudes. Did you get this? And it's like, you look back on it now and you see so much has been exposed from so many leaders within that movement that it was like a lot of blows to my own ego of like, I'm generally good at reading people. And I was like, dang, those guys weren't doing everything perfect. Like, and then you start to really unravel things and you realize that I always get so stuck on the church at Ephesus, especially in Revelation, where he's like, lists off all the things you did right. And it was like, that's the church we want to be. And then he's like, but you forgot to have love. And I'm taking the lampstand because of that. And it's like, that's what I felt like it ended up becoming with me, was like, and that happened pretty later on. We moved from, traditionally we were at some Reformed, we were at some Baptist, but we ended up going to a Pentecostal church, which putting somebody who's like a Reformed guy into a Pentecostal church is like, oh, okay, all right, you claim it, fine, all right, I'm just gonna let that one slide, okay, okay, we're gonna pray, we're gonna do that, all right. It was a lot of those things, and it was like, looking at it now, it was like that was the best place for me to be, because God said, we got to shape some edges here, because you're not getting me, you're getting another part of me again. You're just doing what you did over here. Now you don't believe works are for salvation, you believe it's grace is abounding and all of this, but you're a jerk. So now we need to find the middle where it's like, you're missing the picture. If the picture is we're going to have these debates and arguments, or you need to pound people on the head, then we need to kind of pull back and reshape and understand that it's love, this love for me first. Theology is important because you need to know who you love. Like your walk and who you surround yourself with, all those things are important, but all of that is first in priority with love. And that's where I fell at, and I was like, okay, I'm great. I'm in a good point. I'm starting to get back on fire for God. And then it kind of all just fell off.
What caused the fall off for you?
So it was a twofold thing. So I was working at a church, and I had started to have issues because the pastor there was very abusive. It was widely known, and I was very outspoken about it, but was criticized for being outspoken about it. And then that morphed into, from both my own ego and own like desire for like, so backing up a little, like we both went to Liberty. I went for politics. I have a public policy master's in public policy. I was very into politics. So like I believed in like, hey, we need to work change. Like let's do this. Let's do these organizations. Let's do these things. And what ended up starting is because I was so outspoken, it wasn't doing it in the right method, and that caused issues. But also at the same time, there was just such a toxic system in place that God was trying to tell me, okay, you're done. It's time for you to go to a new spot. And I was like, no, I need to stay here and change it. And that kept hitting, and that kind of led to this massive fallout where, I had shared my issues with my faith, which had started because like, I was running a political podcast on the side, and I started getting, especially during the 2020 election, I was outspoken against both candidates, kind of just doing the news reporting that I was doing. And I remember after the election, I started getting death threats from people. And I was just like, what is it? And I would go check these people out, and they all had God first, love Jesus in their bio. And that was the start of like, what the heck? And I remember sharing that with a pastor at the church while I'm going through all this church hurt too, and getting pulled into a performance review and going, we need your faith to get better because you've said all these things and all these doubts you have. And I'm like, I thought I was sharing that with my pastor. I didn't know I was sharing that with my employer. And it broke me pretty hard there. And I was like, all right, I'm tired. And the whole thing fell apart. It ended up blowing up. And we were out. And that was the start of the kind of like, okay, I don't know what I feel. I don't know. I just tired. That's what it was. And then about a year later, my mom got diagnosed with cancer. And I remember hearing about it. And the doctors were like, hey, you got a year. And we were like, well, that's not going to happen. We're going to do this. And you kind of go through those stages of like, okay, we can do this. We can get through this. And immediately you're like, I got to pray. Because now God's real. I need him to be real. I have to have him be real because he's got to save my mom because he can do it. And we prayed, and we were hardcore doing it. We had hope at moments. And I think that was the hardest part, is there was points where we were like, okay, she made it through radiation. This is going to be great. There's a lot of suffering in that. Like, cancer is not a disease that as it hits with this beauty of like a Hallmark movie where they're like, I'm going to keep fighting. And it's like, I used to get so mad at seeing those like encouraging things where it's like, they fought hard. And it's like, cancer kicked your freaking butt. It is brutal on the family, on the caretakers, on everything. Like, my mom was a lively person. She's the reason for half of my hobbies and passions. Like, and watching her just suffer through something like this was really shaking me to my core, because I knew theologically, like I still had that relevance of like, God is good. He's doing all the things for your good. Like, okay, remember the story of Job. Remember all these things. But I'm still watching someone suffer. And what I kept going back to was these pastors who I'd worked with for years, who had embezzled money, who had abused people, who'd slept around, who'd molested. How are they still doing these things in your name, and you're not doing anything? And my mom, who was faithfully in the front row of church every day, who gave and gave and gave and gave and is pleading with you to save her, and you're doing nothing. And it just kept every day wrecking me. And I was trying, and I remember my prayers early on were so faithful and were like fiery prayers from the back in the day. And as it got worse and worse, the prayers got weaker, because I was just like, you're really not going to do anything. Like, you're not going to intervene. You're going to let this happen. And I kept fighting this like thought, because it just, I remember telling my wife, I was like, this is it. This is the thread. I'm hanging on to my faith by a string, and it's about to get cut. Like, I don't understand him. And there was a lot of nights of crying and a lot of nights of just like, I got the theology of it. I understood logically like that God's not doing this because he's evil and like this is just a fallen world. And I remember speaking when I spoke at my mom's funeral, because eventually she did pass. I said it was like a cold bucket. The theology was nothing. It wasn't helpful. Like that whole young restless reform movement, all the things I had built my faith on that I thought I'd gotten past crumbled in an instant because they didn't serve any purpose to me, because they weren't comforting. And I was just, I just remember that night just crying uncontrollably, not knowing what to do next, because my mom was a part of our family. Like she was that foundation. Like we're a Spanish family. Like family is everything. And she was a part of like what held us all together. And like, I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know where it was going to go. And I really thought the next day I was going to wake up and be able to be like, all right, God's not real. This is easier. Because he's just not good. Like he can't be good. And it just didn't happen like I expected it to. Like that didn't, instead what I woke up to was a little bit of a thought of like, it was the first time I went to a verse that I don't really think about, which was like, it was this constant thought of like Jesus wept. And it was this reminder of like, okay, your faith has been logical. It's been really like you trying to work out, but has it been personal? And is God personal? And is Jesus personal? And I'd go back to this quote from a long time ago where the pastor talked about your faith is like, or life is a lot like looking at a stained glass mirror from an inch away. It's a mess, it's broken, but you don't know what the beauty of it is. And I was like, okay, maybe I can hang my hat on that. And I tried that for a while, and it worked for a little bit, but it really wasn't until another pastor was just like, he preached a message, but I also kind of got to vent to him a little bit of like, I don't understand why God could have saved my mom. He could have stepped in at any moment and saved him. He could have told all these pastors that have caused harm, and he could have ended all of them. He could have demonstrated all of these things at some point, and he didn't. And I don't understand it. And that pastor went, I don't either. And I was just like, I said something off the cuff that I didn't even think was real, because it's like, you don't think of this, but I was like, why did God give my mom cancer? He could have stopped it. He let it happen. And the pastor again was like, I don't know, man. And it was just like, it felt like a cop-out answer, but it was like the most honest someone had been, which was just like, that could be what happened, but I don't have the answer, and I don't think you're going to find it. And it was like, it felt dumb because it wasn't an answer, but it was at least a point where I was like at the bottom and had felt for the first time that I wasn't free falling in my faith anymore. It was just finally confronted with somebody being honest and going, yeah, man, I don't have the answer. Like, you're not going to find it in the theology part anymore. Like, this is it. I don't know. What do you think? That's what really wrecked my faith, I think, was that year or two of my life just, being just slammed with what could be the worst possible thing, imaginable. Like, I love my mom. She was the reason I cooked. She's the reason I got into video. She's the reason I did photography. She's the reason I got into politics. She's the reason for so much of what I do. And she was somebody I always could call and talk to about these things, and it was, even now, like, not having her, like, she doesn't get to grow up with my son, who she loved and adored. She doesn't get to do those things. And it was just, that was what wrecked my faith, was just trying to reconcile God didn't step in and do anything. And that's where it all kind of free fell for a while.
So before the free fall, how do you think you saw God?
I think before the free fall, I saw God at kind of three distinct points. It was, I saw God as this awesome, like, rule follower dude who's a reward genie, do good, he does good, boom. Then in college, I saw God as fire and brimstone-y, kind of like, I'm going to have my power demonstrated. And it was like, you're not going to get wrong. I'm going to strike down those. And it was this like warrior God. And I see him a lot different now. It was a lot more of a humble, a God who is all of those things, but also a God who's there. And he's the God that still heals those who are going, I want to believe. I want to, but I'm struggling. And he's not a God that strikes against that. And that's kind of where it still reigns. I want to be like, it's perfect. I'm great now and it's all better. And it's like, I'm not. I still struggle. You know, going to therapy after my mom was lost, I kind of always cling to this line that my therapist said in the passing. She said two things, and I thought it was really good. One was I expressed my frustration with, why did God not go after these guys who are doing all these things in his name, who are clearly hurting his messaging and his people? Why is he not protecting his flock? Like, what farmer or whatever shepherd in the sense allows wolves to hang out with his sheep? Why would you let that happen? And she was like, you want earthly punishment. And God doesn't operate like that. And it was a big thing for me because it was like, I wanted revenge. I wanted the ministry of pain to come out. And that was like the big thing of like, God doesn't operate on that kind of timing. You know, because sure, these guys could get arrested and go to jail. That's one thing. But if they're doing things against God is an eternal punishment, it's totally different. And it was a weird way to reconcile that. But the bigger thing was this reminder of like, she said, you need to stay with God, lean in. Because this is a point where you're like your son, and she mentioned my kid, and she was like, he holds your hand right when you cross the street. Yeah, and he's like, because he's a little nervous with the cars, and he's like, yeah, and she's like, him holding the hand, he thinks is what makes him safe, but what keeps him safe is actually you. And it was like, she's like, hold the hand to God right now, because holding on is what's going to make you feel safe, but in reality, what's actually saving you is God. And it was this weird, again, metaphor that just clicked with me that helped me kind of feel closer. And that's kind of what I am right now. I'm a kid holding on to God as we cross the street, and I don't know when we're going to get to the other side, but I'm going to keep holding on because I got through what is arguably one of the worst things I could have experienced. And I'm still clinging.
What do you think, how do you think your coping was during that time? Like, what did you use to cope?
When my mom was sick, my coping fell into, my coping's been different for everything. So early on in my faith, my first kind of like free fall, my coping was like, drink, and, it was real early on. It was like pornography, whatever it could be. Those kind of things that were like stimulants of the world that would make me feel better and be like, middle finger to God, man. You know what? Fine, I'm going to go the opposite way. When I was older, when my mom was sick, the coping was just anger. It was just screaming at God, and a lot of these big things for my wife, which I would tell her and be like, he's not real, is he? Like, this can't be real. This is all stupid. Like, it was those kind of like moments that became coping mechanisms, because it was like, that's how I wanted to cling to it. If I could just generate enough anger, it would make me numb the other pain. And if I could just be mad enough, and that's really what all of that coping was. It was like, what can I do to numb what I'm feeling? Because it's easier than having your entire faith deconstructed in a way like that. Like, deconstruction is one thing, but like having it completely, like the rug ripped out from under you the way it is, it can be earth shattering. Like, it really can be. And that's kind of where I stood with that for a while, was like, that was anger. Anger was the easier thing to lean in. My mom was Puerto Rican, my dad's Irish. Like, anger comes naturally to our family. So it was like easy to lean into that. And that became the coping mechanism for a while. And that, I think that lasted for a while. And then it became, when my mom did pass, it became a little bit of sadness and depression. Those were the coping mechanisms there were more just woe is me and kind of encouraging those feelings. And then there was a bit of like this over faith where I was like, God is amazing and it's all good. And it's like, that lasted very short. Like, that coping mechanism didn't fulfill anything.
As you've kind of tried to hold on to God and reconsider your faith and, get back in with community, how do you think, like, how do you feel about that journey?
That's been the harder one, because for a long time after everything, after leaving church and after the fallouts and all this stuff, and then my mom being sick, like, it all happened so fast together. Like, we left the church. We had lied to ourselves as a family, and we're like, we'll get back to it. But then life happened, and then like when my mom got sick, it was really hard to get into church because it was like we were taking care of things and doing all these things. And then after everything finally ended, I was like, I I don't want to go to church. It's like, I don't know that I can sit through one. And a lot of it became a wrestle with me for two things. One, because I realized quickly that I still held on to this like part of me where it was like, when you're young wrestlers reform, you got to sit there and listen to the pastor and write down everything he said wrong. And I realized I still did a lot of that because I was still like lying to myself about, I got to find the perfect church. And it's like, that doesn't exist. Like, this is not how that works. But community took a while to get back into. And it really was the urging of my wife, who ironically was like struggling with her own ability to just go to church because she was hurt the most from the church fallout we had, to the point where she couldn't even go into services without panic attacks. And seeing all of that occur, I was just like, I don't know. And it was really friends, especially Lance, who's behind camera, was really encouraging about like, hey, we still want you to come. And like those pastors at some of the churches I was at were very encouraging and stepped in. And like, despite a lot of the stuff, we're like, hey, we're here for you. We understand. If you don't want to come, don't come. You don't even have to come. But if you need us, let us know. And that kept encouraging us. And it was eventually the point of like my son, ironically, who was like, he had gone to church with his grandparents. And he came back and he was like, I want to go to church. And I was like, okay, all right, God, you're going to find a new way to get us in. And, you know, he doesn't like to be away from us. Going to school, he hates, he liked all this stuff. But when we got to church, he went straight back and had a great time and, you know, so excited and was like, can I go back next week? And I was like, all right, God will find a way. So we started to get back into community, but that was hard. And it's hard still to trust pastors it's hard to trust pastors, but the reality is that's just a lie. The reality is it's hard to trust God again, because that's really who I felt wronged me. And I was just targeting it at everything else. No, it's the pastors. It's got to be the pastors. No, it's this community. It's the theology. It's all these things. And all of it was just this facade of like, I don't trust God because I see bad is occurring and you're supposed to be good, which is, it seems so simple to be that kind of an argument, but it can get so many layers to it when we just put our personal issues into it.
Yeah, you're hitting what I talk about in my book in the chapter on power and protection. We try to take control of our own lives because we don't like the way God has stewarded the power that we've given him in the past. So that gives us trust issues. And so we're like, I got to take control back. But also you're hitting protection. Like you felt like God was supposed to shield you from these pains and he didn't. And so it's like, I got to protect myself. And all of that is trust. And I love how you said, like, I was using all of these other things, pointing like my issues towards them, but actually the core issue is I didn't trust God. And I talk a lot about that in the book, because I think sometimes it's easier to attack the people we can see than to really vent at the person we can't. Yeah. And a lot of our traumas and pains, really, while we do have issues with leadership and different things, the core issue is God. Because if you're all powerful, all knowing and all loving, this shouldn't be happening at all. I always use the illustration, my parents are good parents. If they knew something was about to happen to me that was horrible, they had knowledge of it and they had the ability to stop it, they would never let it happen. And so you're telling me you love me more than them, well, what is this? Yeah. And so that builds like these questions. And I love how you said that the pastor, he was like, I don't know, because that's what my professor said to me that really freed me up when I was questioning God. Like, it's okay not to know the answer.
Yeah, and I think there was the honesty and the starkness of that like, it just makes you, I don't know, it complements the fact that like at some point you're just screaming into the void when you're yelling at God, because it just, like he's not, like you said, he's not there. Like I could yell at a pastor and imagine, you know, the harm that you should come to those people who are being bad, but like I don't have like a physical God to like throw something at, you know, and those like sound violent terms, but it's like that's how you feel when this anger is happening, like someone's hurting you. And that's really dead on. It was just literally that feeling of like, I can only scream into the void for so long. I need something else to blame. Like I need something physical to wrap my mind around of why, like what's wrong with this. And just being honest is sometimes both the scariest and the best thing that could have ever happened.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I was at my most angriest at God and I was just going off. And it was something freeing after like really getting everything off my chest as it relates to him. And it's like, oh man, it's okay to do that. Like, I mean, some people have different levels of how
Yeah.
they do it. But I think I only got to the other side by venting my frustration.
Yeah. It's a lot of like, and this is why I was a big proponent of like therapy and having people to talk to. But really, what did it for me was making the connection that like, okay, if God is a part of your family, are you going to, if there's a frustration, like if I have an issue with my wife, one of the worst things you can do in marriage is just sit there and stew in your issues with your wife and just be like, she needs to do these things, but not say anything and just expect things to change, like, and avoid those confrontations. I think that's the worst thing for a marriage. Like, but what really can help it is going, I don't understand why this is happening and why you're doing this or why this is going on. And it can really create these conversations where you start to understand, oh, I'm not perfect either. There's some things I'm doing that are causing this. And that's really the relationship with God that we should be seeking. Like one where we can be like, hey, I don't get you. I don't know why you're letting this happen when this happened and this happened. And I need to express it. And, you know, I would always wanted that moment where like God would just speak to me like he spoke to, you know, all the charismatic friends I had, but you know, never did. But what I ended up finding was he put the right people around me and oftentimes led me to the right answers within the Bible that were like, hey, this is what you needed to hear. This is what you're trying to find. The answer's there. And that's kind of the big thing I've learned, at least in the last year.
Last question. What would you tell your younger self about God?
He is both bigger than you could ever imagine and more personal than you could ever understand. Like, I keep one of the stories I go back to every single time was when I was on fire for God and I had just started as a youth pastor. I was like, this is it. We're going to do this. I am so ready to do so much awesome stuff. You're already imagining like the stadiums you're going to preach at. Like, this is going to be great. And we did a youth lock-in and a person texted in on like our question thing because I was like, yeah, this is a great idea. I'm, you know, in my early 20s and, you know, I can answer every question they have. And she said, if God loves me, why did he let me get molested? And I was like, I don't know how to answer that. I'm not ready for that. And in that moment, God went from this massive, awesome, like epic soldier to this really personal and deep person. And that's the moment I want to always try to go back to, is because God can be this huge warrior protector thing, but also this deep personal person who's there as we're crying. You know, he's both big and small, and that's what I would go back and tell myself.
I said last question, but I have a final question. For those who are listening and they might be struggling with grief and they might have a similar story as you, what would you tell them?
I think first and foremost is it's okay to go, God, I don't get it. Like, I think lying to yourself and being like, oh, it's awesome, God, you're just working all things together for your good. I get it, or for my good. I understand. It's all to glory you. And it's like, I don't think we appreciate when Paul says in all things to rejoice. Like, we don't understand the magnitude of where he's saying that from and what he's saying there. And it's like, he's not saying that while sitting on a boat, happy as can be, you know, throwing back food. He's saying that in his own struggles. And I think when we stop lying to ourselves that the Christian life is going to be this beautiful, awesome, your best days are the days to come, like tomorrow's going to be better. And it's like, no, tomorrow could be worse. And I think when you lean into that and are honest with yourself, that's the first step. The second step is find someone to talk to. Because I think internally, when we battle with ourselves, it's the worst battle you can get into because you're your own worst dialogue. Because you're going to always agree with yourself. And I think trying to reconcile things within yourself is really hard, and finding either a therapist or somebody you could talk to that can really help you, and then finding a community of believers who are also okay with being honest. And that's the difference, because you can have a community of believers. You can have, you know, I've been a part of many life groups, small groups, Bible studies, whatever you want to call them, where you have the leader who's just what I call the always ever happy Christian. And like being in those groups does not help you, because like I've been in those where like, you know, you're in your Sunday school class and you're like, hey man, I'm just feeling tortured by God. He doesn't seem to love me. And like, they're like, yeah, it's crazy. but God is love. It's like, that didn't help me at all. And like getting away from that community and finding an authentic community where you're like, hey, I don't feel like God loves me. And like somebody else can be like, yeah, I get that. I don't know. I know he does, but man, why does it not feel that way? Like letting you just have that point where you can express it and feel it, I think is so crucial to being able to do that,
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for your honesty and vulnerability. I was blessed by this conversation, and I know our audience will be too. If you are struggling in the area where you feel disappointed by God, this is the book for you, When Faith Disappoints, the gap between what we believe and what we experience. I believe for people who are wrestling with God, this will be an aid to them, and you can get it wherever books are sold. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, you can watch all our past episodes at jude3project.org, on our YouTube channel, wherever you stream your favorite podcast. Remember, you can donate to the Jude 3 Project at jude3project.org, hitting that donate tab, or give by mail. Here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you know what you believe and why. Until next time, grace and peace and God bless.
Many of you know about my faith crisis I had when I was an undergrad student at the University of North Florida, but many of you don't know about the wrestle I had when I was a seminary student. I had heard about kids being murdered by terrorists in the Middle East. It struck me. I was grappling with that thing, and we were learning about the problem of evil in class, but it just didn't emotionally satisfy me, if I'm honest. I could explain the problem theologically, philosophically, logically, but emotionally, it just didn't hit. And I was wrestling with the Lord. So I went to my New Testament professor and I said, hey, Dr. Purser, I'm wrestling with this. And he said, me too. That was the answer I needed, to know somebody that has spent all this time in school, has walked with the Lord this many years, could still wrestle with his faith, and it was okay. He normalized the struggle for me. In my debut book, When Faith Disappoints, I want to give you what Dr. Purser gave me, the understanding that it's okay to wrestle. In this book, When Faith Disappoints, the gap between what we believe and what we experience, we explore the pain points that cause people to wrestle with faith. Personhood. Who am I? Power. You've given God control of your life, but you don't like the direction he's steered you. Protection. Why didn't God protect you as a child, as an adult? In so many cases, you feel unprotected. Provision. We know scripture says that God will supply all of our needs, but sometimes you feel like you still don't have what you need. Purpose. Why am I on this earth? Pleasure. It seems like you're sacrificing so much as a Christian, and the return doesn't meet what you hoped it would. You don't have joy. You don't have happiness. And the one that has gripped us so much post-COVID, peace. Anxiety seems to be more of a companion to you than peace. I know the wrestle, and many of you are in the gap between what you believe and what you experience. And I hope this book will be a balm to help bridge that gap, because many of you are struggling with disappointment. In the midst of disappointment, I hope these words will provide hope. Grab When Faith Disappoints. Available now wherever books are sold.